The question is simple: who slaughtered an entire family at Hinterkaifeck Farm? The answer is we don't know, and that's what makes this story so unsettling. It's not just a murder mystery, it's a ghost story, a tale of family secrets, and a police failure all rolled into one. It happened 100 years ago, but the chill of it has never really gone away. The place itself was barely a place. Hinterkaifeck wasn't a town or a village. It was just a name for a farm, set back from the main road, hidden by trees, about an hour's drive north of Munich. It was isolated, the kind of place where you could scream and only the cows would hear you. Living there in 1922 was the Gruber family. The head of the family was Andreas Gruber. He was in his 60s. People in the nearby village of Kaifeck described him as a difficult man. He was known for being ill-tempered, controlling, and not well-liked by his neighbors. His wife, Kazelia, was older, in her 70s. She was reportedly a devout and quiet woman, likely worn down by years of life with a hard man on a hard farm. Then there was their daughter, Victoria Gabriel. She was a widow in her mid-30s. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had been a soldier. The official story was that he was killed in the trenches of France during the First World War. Victoria lived on the farm with her 2 children. The first was Kazelia, a 7-year-old girl named after her grandmother. The second was a little boy named Josef, just 2 years old. The family was not a happy one. There were dark rumors that followed them, whispers that were too ugly to be said out loud in church. The talk of the village was that Andreas Gruber was not just Victoria's father. It was said he was also her lover. People believed that little Josef was not the son of her dead husband, Karl. They believed he was the child of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria. This wasn't just gossip. The two had actually been convicted in court for it years earlier. The shame clung to the farm like the damp Bavarian air. The final person living in Hinterkaifeck was the maid. But maids didn't last long there. The previous maid had quit about 6 months before the murders. She left in a hurry. She told people the farm was haunted. She claimed she heard footsteps in the attic and disembodied voices. She felt a presence in the house that terrified her. She was convinced there was something evil in that place and she wanted no part of it. On the last day of March in 1922, a new maid arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. It was her first day on the job. She couldn't have known it would also be her last. Before Maria arrived, the strange things the old maid talked about had gotten worse. The days leading up to the murders were filled with a quiet, creeping dread. Andreas Gruber himself, a man not known for flights of fancy, told his neighbors about the odd occurrences. A few days before the attack, Andreas found a set of footprints in the fresh snow. They led from the dense forest at the edge of his property directly to the farmhouse. He followed them. They walked up to the back door and maybe circled the machine shed. But the strange part, the part that made the hair on his neck stand up, was that there were no footprints leading away. It was as if a ghost had walked out of the woods and simply vanished into the walls of his home. He spent hours searching the property, the barn, the sheds. He found no one. That night, the family heard noises from the attic. Footsteps, a dragging sound, as if someone was pacing back and forth right above their heads. Andreas grabbed his rifle and went up to look. The attic was dusty and empty. There was no one there. He checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. Yet the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, remained. The next day, another puzzle. The house keys, which were always kept in a specific place, were gone. Andreas searched everywhere, but they had vanished. It was as if the house itself was turning against them. Then, a strange newspaper from Munich appeared on the porch. No one in the family subscribed to it. No one in the village had seen the delivery person. It was just there, an object from the outside world appearing without explanation. Andreas told these stories to a few people he trusted. He was confused, not yet scared. He was a practical man. He thought maybe a vagrant was hiding on his property, someone looking for food or a place to sleep. He rejected offers from his neighbors to come stay with him or to send help. He insisted he could handle it himself. It was a fatal miscalculation. He wasn't dealing with a simple thief. He was dealing with a patient, silent predator who was already inside the house, living in the attic, watching the family, learning their routines, and waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came on the evening of March 31st. The new maid, Maria, had just arrived. The day turned into night. A cold front was moving in. The routine of the farm would have started. The cows needed milking. The animals needed to be fed. Investigators pieced together what they think happened next. The killer, or killers, had a plan. They knew the family's habits. They knew that sooner or later, someone would come out to the barn. It seems they started by luring one of the family members out. Perhaps they made a noise, a commotion with one of the animals. The first to go was likely Victoria, then her daughter, little Kazelia, then Victoria's mother, the elderly Kazelia, and finally the patriarch Andreas. One by one, they were led into the dark, hay-filled barn like lambs to the slaughter. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe. It was a brutal, personal weapon. The attacks were ferocious, aimed at the head. The killer met each of them in the darkness of the barn and brought the mattock down with incredible force. Now, they didn't stand a chance. After killing the 4 of them, the killer or killers stacked their bodies in a corner of the barn, covered them partially with hay, and left them there. But the work wasn't done. The killer walked from the barn back to the farmhouse. Inside were the 2 remaining victims. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was in her bedchamber. She was killed in her sleep, her head crushed by the same mattock. In the nursery, sleeping in a cot next to his mother's empty bed, was 2-year-old Joseph. He was the last to die. The killer entered the room and ended the little boy's life with a single devastating blow. And then, silence. What happened next is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. The killer did not flee, he stayed. For the next 4 days, the killer lived in the house of the dead. He or they ate the food in the kitchen. A meal had been prepared and consumed after the murders. He tended to the livestock. The cows were milked, and the cattle were fed. Someone even kept the fire going in the hearth. The farm dog was tied up outside, unharmed. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney all weekend. They just assumed the Grubers were home. No one thought anything was wrong. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was isolated, but not completely cut off. People expected to see the Gruber. Little Casilia was supposed to be at school on Saturday, but she never showed up. The family was expected at church on Sunday, but their pew was empty. The postman noticed the mail from the past few days was still sitting in the box, untouched. By Tuesday, April 4th, the neighbors were getting concerned. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a nearby farmer, and a man with a complicated history with the Gruber family, decided to check on them. He gathered a couple of other men and they walked over to the farm. The place was eerily quiet. The dog was tied up, but nothing else moved. They called out, but there was no answer. They peered through the windows, but saw nothing. Finally, they decided to force their way in. They managed to open a door to the barn first. The scene that met them was a nightmare. The smell of hay mixed with the metallic scent of blood. At first, they didn't see anything. But then, under a pile of disturbed hay, they saw a foot. They pulled back the hay and found the bodies. 4 of them, stacked together, the faces were so badly damaged they were almost unrecognizable. It was Andreas, his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria, and their granddaughter, 7-year-old Casilia. Horrified, the men backed out of the barn and went to the main house. They forced a door and went inside. The house was cold and still. In one of the bedrooms, they found the body of the maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her bed. In another room, in his crib, lay little Joseph. Both had been killed in the same horrific way. The police were called from Munich, over 100 kilometers away, but this was 1922. Forensic science was in its infancy. The crime scene was a disaster from the very beginning. Before the professional investigators could even arrive, dozens of neighbors, villagers, and curious onlookers had walked through the farm. They tramped through the house, through the barn, touching things, moving things, contaminating any potential evidence. The bodies themselves were moved. The initial search was a chaotic mess. The autopsies were conducted right there on the farm in the barn where 4 of the victims were found. The local doctor, Johann Baptist Oehmüller, performed the grim task. He found that all 6 victims had been killed by extreme blunt force trauma to the head. The skulls were crushed. Little Casilia, the 7-year-old girl, had apparently survived the initial attack for several hours. The doctor found she had torn out clumps of her own hair in agony before she died. The bodies were then beheaded by the coroner, so the heads could be sent to Munich for further examination by clairvoyants, a desperate and bizarre move that showed how out of their depth the investigators were. The heads were eventually lost during the chaos of World War II and were never seen again. The police had a sextuple homicide on their hands and no clear answers. The initial theory was a robbery gone wrong. The Grubers were known to keep cash on the farm, but this theory quickly fell apart. A large amount of money was found untouched in the house. Gold coins and paper bills were still there. If this was a robbery, the thief was a terrible one. The motive didn't fit the crime. Robbers don't typically murder an entire family, including a toddler, and then stick around for 4 days to feed the cows. The brutality of the killings suggested a personal motive. This was a crime of rage, of passion. The police started looking at people who knew the Grubers, people who had a reason to hate them, and the list of suspects began to grow. Over the years, more than 100 people would be questioned, but the investigation always seemed to circle back to a few key individuals. The first, and for many the most likely suspect, was the neighbor who found the bodies, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The Schlittenbauer's connection to the family was deep and messy. He had been having an affair with Victoria for years. He firmly believed that he, not Andreas Gruber, was the biological father of little Joseph. He had been paying child support for the boy. Victoria had recently decided to sue him for more money, creating a lot of tension between them. Schlittenbauer's behavior on the day of the discovery was also highly suspicious. He was one of the first to enter the barn. He disturbed the bodies, pulling a door over them, potentially contaminating the scene. When they entered the house, he seemed to know his way around perfectly, even picking up a set of keys from a lock as if he knew where they were. Some witnesses claimed he was strangely calm, almost detached, for a man who had just discovered his friends and his supposed son brutally murdered. The case for Schlittenbauer was strong. He had a motive: the financial burden of the child, the shame of the affair, and the anger of the lawsuit. He had the opportunity, he lived nearby, he knew the farm layout intimately. He was a strong, capable farmer who would have been familiar with a mattock. In his later years, he made strange, cryptic comments to people. He once told a local that he was the one who had to settle things at Hinterkaifeck. On his deathbed, he supposedly refused to give a final confession, saying he was taking his secrets with him to the grave. But despite the heavy suspicion, police could never find any concrete evidence to link him to the crime. He had an alibi, though a weak one, claiming he was with his sons. Without proof, he remained a free man. The second major suspect was a ghost. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, was reported killed in action in 1914. But his body was never recovered. In the chaotic aftermath of the Great War, records were often lost or incorrect. A persistent theory emerged that Carl Gabriel had not died in France. What if he had survived? Maybe he was captured by the Russians and had only just made his way back to Germany. Imagine the scene: a soldier returns from the hell of war, a ghost coming back to life, only to find his wife had a child with another man. And worse, he hears the village rumors that his wife was in an incestuous relationship with her own father, and that the child might be a product of that union. It's a powerful motive for a crime of unimaginable rage. Some former comrades of Carl Gabriel later came forward claiming they had seen him after his supposed death. One said he saw a man who looked exactly like Gabriel in 1918. Another story suggested he had taken on a new identity and was living in Russia. This theory explains the personal nature of the killings. It explains the rage. A soldier trained in killing would have the skill and the coldness to carry out such an act. But like the case against Schlittenbauer, it was all speculation. There was no proof Carl Gabriel was alive. No one ever found him. He remained a phantom, a convenient but unprovable explanation for an impossible crime. As the investigation stalled, other names were thrown around. The Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton, were suspected. They were known to have connections to a political murder in the area, and there were whispers that one of them might have also been having an affair with Victoria. The police investigated them, but their alibis seemed to hold up. Years later, a sister of the Gumps claimed on her deathbed that her brothers were the murderers. But by then, both men were long dead, and there was no way to verify her claim. Other theories pointed to vagrants or drifters. The years after World War I were a time of great poverty and social upheaval in Germany. The countryside was full of desperate men, many of whom were former soldiers suffering from the trauma of war. The idea that a stranger had been living in the Gruber's attic is compelling. It fits with the footprints in the snow and the noises Andreas heard. Perhaps this stranger was discovered, and he killed the family to cover his tracks. But it doesn't quite explain why he would stay on the farm for 4 days. And it doesn't explain the focused, personal brutality of the killings. A random vagrant might kill for food or money, but this felt different. This felt like an execution. Years turned into decades. The case was officially closed and reopened several times. New investigators looked at the old files, re-interviewed aging witnesses, and followed cold leads that went nowhere. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was torn down in 1923, less than a year after the murders. The locals wanted to erase the dark stain on their community. They leveled the buildings and plowed the land. Today, there is nothing left but an empty field and a small religious shrine erected in memory of the victims. But the story never died. It became a dark piece of German folklore, a campfire tale told to scare children. The combination of the isolated farm, the creepy events leading up to the murders, the dysfunctional family with its terrible secret, the extreme violence, and the fact that the killer lived with his victims for days created a perfect storm of horror that has fascinated people for a century. In 2007, a group of students at a German police academy decided to take on the Hinterkaifeck murders as a cold case project. They used modern investigative techniques to re-examine all the available evidence, from the original police reports to witness statements. They analyzed the crime scene photos and autopsy notes. After months of work, they produced a final report. Their conclusion was both frustrating and tantalizing. They stated that after all this time, it was impossible to definitively solve the case. Too much evidence had been contaminated or lost forever. Key witnesses were long dead. But they said they had managed to narrow down the list of suspects and had settled on one person as the most probable killer. They had a prime suspect. However, out of respect for the suspect's living relatives, they refused to name the person publicly. Most people who have studied the case believe their unnamed suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He remains the man at the center of the web. His proximity, his motive, his strange behavior, and the persistent local belief in his guilt make him the most logical candidate. The police students likely came to the same conclusion, but lacked a single piece of irrefutable DNA or fingerprint evidence that a modern case would require. So they could only point in his direction, not prove it. But without a named suspect, the mystery remains. Who was the man who walked out of the forest and into the Gruber farmhouse? Was he a neighbor consumed by rage and jealousy? A husband returned from the dead to exact a terrible revenge? Or was he a complete stranger, a faceless drifter whose presence in the attic was the first sign of a random, meaningless act of violence? We are left only with the chilling facts. The footprints that led nowhere, the sounds in the attic, the 6 bodies in the barn and the house, and the smoke curling from the chimney for 4 days, a sign of life in a house of death. The killer of Hinterkaifeck was not just a murderer. He was a ghost who took control of the farm, finished the family's chores, and then, after 4 days, simply walked away, vanishing back into the woods from which he came, taking the answer with him forever. The question of who slaughtered the Gruber family is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a story that serves as a dark reminder that some questions have no answers and some doors are better left unopened. The evil that visited that small Bavarian farm in 1922 was real, and the fact that it was never caught, never explained, is the most terrifying part of all. It leaves a void, an emptiness, where justice should be. And into that void, our worst fears are free to wander.